Boycott Disney.
Boycott McDonald's.
Boycott Coca-Cola.
Boycott.
Boycott. In 2020, Israel spent $70 million so that you don't get the message that we're going to be covering in this video. If you haven't been living under a rock, you've most likely been told to boycott a bunch of companies because of their role in supporting Israel with the ongoing conflict right now. You probably heard the words BDS and are vaguely trying to follow it and are vaguely trying to understand what exactly it is, but you're not really sure. All you're sure is you really care about the Palestinians and you don't want to help the Israelis out. So today I want to inject in a bit of rigor into the discourse, and I'm going to cover exactly what Israel is doing to try and stop you and me supporting BDS and who it is giving that money to and why it is doing that. I'll also explain what the point of BDS is and what in fact would hurt Israel the most economically to create the pressure on it to comply with international law. And I'll end this video detailing a very practical guide on how you and me can actually implement BDS in an impactful way and in a moral and ethical way as well. Before we begin, folks, please do like and subscribe to this channel for maximum BDS effectiveness. Please also share this video with your friends and your family. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. It was most prominently championed by a Palestinian called Omar Barghouti, but has gained widespread support across the Muslim world and pro-Palestine activist groups. But there are actually many forms BDS can take, but the core concept is pretty simple. Owen Jones explained it really nicely in a video from 2 years ago.
It means boycotts of an apartheid regime, from sport to culture. It means divestment, to get banks to local councils and other organisations to divest, withdraw investments from Israel. And it means sanctions, such as banning business with illegal settlements or the sale of arms to Israel.
The whole aim behind the BDS movement is to gradually ratchet up the pressure, boycott, divest and sanctions on Israel until it's left isolated for the illegal activities that it is doing, like other pariah states such as North Korea are left isolated because of their activities. Here's what Omar Barghouti explained to be the purpose of BDS.
Sanctions is the ultimate. That's why it's BDS. S comes at the end. It's no coincidence, because you need a lot of B and D to reach the S.
And boycotting doesn't just include economic boycotting. It also includes cultural and academic boycotting. So artists like Elvis Costello, Gil, Scott Heron, Lauryn Hill, Faithless, Mariana, U2, Bjork, Zakir Hussain, Jean-Luc Godard, Snoop Dogg, Cat Power, Vanessa Paradise have all refused at some point or cancelled Israeli gigs. Stephen Hawking, the very famous physicist, also boycotted an Israeli conference back in 2013 because of his perspectives on the Israeli government's actions at that time. The goals of the BDS movement are very simple: to boycott, divest and sanction Israel until it complies with international law and the universal principles of human rights. The goal is not just to economically weaken Israel and to use it as some kind of punishment for its actions. It's actually to fundamentally weaken Israel's status as just another state on the international scene. When people do BDS, we want to show the international community that Israel is doing things that make it a pariah state. Why is this rebrand so important? Because you see, the world only changes something once it has acknowledged it as evil. Female circumcision doesn't sound too scary, but female genital mutilation does. And when this practice had that rebrand, it quickly got banned. To answer this question, let's just examine how much Israel is spending to stop BDS. In the USA today, 35 states out of the 50 have passed anti-BDS laws. That's 70% of all of the USA. The Israel lobby, which is one of the most powerful lobbies in the USA, has worked incredibly hard to make this happen. In 2020 alone, they spent $70 million primarily in Democratic races. And I ask you the simple question, why would they do this if this was not important to Israel? Mondoweiss, which is a progressive Jewish publication, shares the sordid details. It says that if we look into the details, the top largest Zionist groups collectively hold more than $500 million in assets, which dwarfs the $4 million or so that the pro-Palestine groups have and the $6 million that the liberal Zionist organizations have. The smallest of the pro-Israel lobby has $1.6 million in assets, which is more than the AJP and the American Muslims for Palestine group combined. Mondoweiss also share that the Israel lobby is very specifically focused on the Democratic Party, and the reason why is because the Democrats support the BDS movement at a ratio of nearly 3-1, and that they want to nip in the bud. That's why on November the 22nd, earlier this month, Hill Harper, the US politician, was offered $20 million in funding to run against Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American in Congress, by one of AIPAC's biggest donors.
AIPAC stands for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is a grassroots organization with 3 million members, all dedicated to lobbying towards strengthening US-Israel relations.
Thanks, Khizr. And this also applies to the UK too. Here, 80% of the Conservative Party, the government, are members of the Conservative Friends of Israel, which is a lobby group that advocates for Israeli interests. And Peter Orban also reported that MPs are systematically given donations when they are pro-Israel to their campaign, and their careers are facilitated. And I personally have had conversations off the record with MPs who say that certain MPs will literally join the Conservative Friends of Israel or the Labour Friends of Israel, not because they necessarily care deeply about the topic, but because they know that this group is one of the most effective lobby groups for their career. And this is not a uniquely conservative thing. Tony Blair had in total 15 million of funding that was raised by Michael Levy, who was a very pro-Israeli supporter of the Labour government at that time. And today Keir Starmer has had 5 million contributed by Gary Lubner, who is widely reported to be a staunchly pro-Israel businessman, and Middle East Monitor has actually reported alleged links with his family to benefiting and profiting from the South African apartheid, though Gary Lubner does deny these accusations. All of this is leading the Tory government to introduce a new bill in Parliament, which, by the way, Labour abstained from voting on, to introduce a BDS ban on public bodies, just like in the USA. The Israel lobby do this because they need to maintain Israel's position as a normal state, not a pariah state. And as soon as that mask slips, it's all over, not just because the American aid and trade starts drying up, but even more horrifically, Jews in the USA and the UK will start seeing through the indoctrination that they go on through campaigns like Birthright, that they are sent on to Israel, and they will start to turn against Israel, and they will say, no, we don't want you to do this stuff in my name. And that undermines the entire basis of Israel. Indeed, this is why Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated very explicitly, tackling BDS is one of the top 3 priorities for Israel, alongside dealing with Iranian nuclear weapons and along with dealing with Hamas rockets. BDS is one of the 3 on that list. That is how terrified Israel is of BDS. I don't think I actually need to argue any further on this point. If the Israel lobby are so upset about BDS, it clearly shows it is hurting Israel at some level, and we should continue because we want to create pressure on Israel. But the question now is, what kind of BDS should we adopt? You see, there are 3 basic approaches taken to economically boycotting or sanctioning Israel. The first is the light approach, and it is the approach adopted by people like Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein. Both are Jewish, but also long-term friends of the Palestinian cause, so I think it is worth understanding their perspective, even if many of us instinctively might actually disagree. Listen to this.
They're principled, they're correct. Methodist Church just joined in the other day.
So settlement products and other such things.
The settlements and the occupation are illegal acts.
Agreed.
Okay, and they're brutal, harsh, illegal, violate Security Council orders.
Yes.
So, and actions taken
So
against
that you
them.
support?
That is perfectly legitimate.
What Chomsky and Finkelstein are basically saying is that Israel is a recognized state under international law, and therefore, if we are upholding international law and saying Israel should uphold international law, we should boycott things where Israel is actively contravening international law, as opposed to boycotting Israel at large. Because, as Chomsky says, you might as well boycott any country at that point. Next, we have the medium approach. These people would argue that you should boycott all Israeli companies on the basis that every such company pays taxes to Israel, and we don't want Israel to have that money because it uses those to kill Palestinians. And there are moral challenges even with this argument, because there might be some Arab Israeli companies that pay taxes, businesses that are boycotted as a result of this. Or there might be companies that are really pro-Palestinian within Israel as well. After all, don't forget, B'Tselem and other human rights organizations are actually based in Israel and are the most vocal critics of the Israeli state. So if we are going to boycott companies on the basis of where their taxes are paid, we could actually think, hang on, the US actually is a big supporter of Israel, so we should boycott all US companies as well. So suddenly it becomes a bit inconsistent to just target Israel. Then finally you have the expansive approach. These boycotters go even further and they say, look, boycott all international companies that have been supportive of the Israeli government in any way, shape or form, regardless of whether or not they operate in Israel or not. So my personal view is that the Chomsky approach to boycotting and sanctions does make sense because it is principled, and it is really important to be principled. And I do think that we can go further on a principled basis, and we must have a principled basis, because otherwise this campaign becomes less morally legitimate than we would otherwise like it to be. And this is really important because the end position of where we're ending up is going to be sanctions. And sanctions, the reality is, it's not going to be me who implements sanctions or you who implements sanctions. It's going to be someone like Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak. And so that's why having a rigorous and principled approach to our actions is going to be the thing that convinces those kind of people to take the steps that we need them to take. And the other side to not having a principled approach is that you can end up just not boycotting anything because you're not really sure why you're doing it in the first place. So what would I do? I would absolutely boycott all companies who operate in the occupied territories. Of course, that's a must. But I would then also subjectively look at Israeli companies and international companies and boycott those of those companies that are being particularly egregious in their support of Israel's illegal activities. So for example, it has been widely reported that Intel and HP provide the chips for the Palestinian ID cards that are being used to keep track of them and enforce the apartheid that has been enforced on them. Or CAT, which provides bulldozers to the Israelis to demolish Palestinian homes. So we should definitely consider these sort of things when deciding which companies are deserving of our moral censure. So effectively, my approach would be to combine all three of the light, medium and expansive approaches. Definitely occupied territories, some international companies and some Israeli companies. And to be abundantly clear, the breach of international law does the moral heavy lifting in the cases of all the boycotts of companies operating in the West Bank and the occupied territories. And the direct and persistent link with crimes or immoralities being committed by other companies, such as the ones that I've mentioned, does the ethical heavy lifting in why we are boycotting those companies in those cases. Alhamdulillah, I'm very pleased to see that many of the campaigns and websites and links that are floating around today are actually broadly adopting the approach that I have outlined. More on these and what you can practically do later on. And folks who are still watching this and benefiting, please do like and subscribe if you haven't done, and share this with a friend right now. The South African case is probably one of the most vivid examples of a successful boycott campaign. It was called as early as the 1950s by indigenous South Africans, and then it picked up steam in the 60s when the UN passed an arms embargo, and then further picked up steam in 1973 when the OPEC oil countries implemented an oil embargo on the state, and then finally in the 1980s the West implemented some limited but multilateral sanctions. In a detailed article assessing the impact of the sanctions in the eventual downfall of the apartheid regime, Philip Levy of Yale University examines this point. And interestingly, he says that actually the South African government, because of political and economic turmoil in that period before the multilateral sanctions were implemented, there was a number of lenders to the South African country, like Chase Manhattan Bank, which said that we are not going to renew any short-term loans to this country. And that then sparked off a liquidity crisis as other lenders also followed suit. So Levy is emphasizing the financial crisis caused by these lenders pulling their money out of South Africa as possibly an even more important cause, all of which was caused by the economics and political unrest, which in turn was almost certainly influenced and exacerbated by the global sanctions movement. And fascinatingly, we are seeing echoes of that right now with Israel, though of course it is a much more financially robust country and it gets far more aid from the USA. So during October, Israel quietly and urgently raised $6 billion in debt, and it did it on a much more expensive basis than it would do otherwise, and it did so privately. Why did it do this? Well, it did this because today Israeli debt comes with too much ESG risk, which is code for large corporates and other financial institutions not wanting to touch a country where there is potentially too much blood on its hands. So the South African story arguably shows us that there was some limited economic impact. More importantly, this sanctions movement created the psychological impact on the South African regime itself and also the world as a whole that ultimately led to the things that ended apartheid. But what of the Palestinian boycott? Well, the history of the Palestinian BDS are actually decades old, and it has had success from the very start. Mubarak Awad was a non-violent Palestinian resistor. He caused $1.4 billion in losses to Israel through civil disobedience, completely non-violent, and boycotting until he caused so much damage that he got deported from Israel. In recent years, we've also had welcome wins. After a concerted campaign against Israeli dates, grown on illegal settlements, and exploiting Palestinian labor at really cheap prices, the total Israeli date exports to the USA went from 10.7 million tons in 2015 down to 3.1 million in 2018. And the wins keep on coming, from divesting to boycotting, exiting the Israeli market as a whole after being strongly criticized. Here are a few examples. You've got Oliver Cookson, who is a former founder of MyProtein. He decided by himself that he's going to divest his entire portfolio from Israeli businesses, and it's a portfolio of 500 million, and he has been joined by a number of other family offices who are doing the same thing. And then you have The Guardian reports that due to campaigns against companies like Veolia, Orange, G4S, CRH, they've actually now pulled out of Israel because of these boycott campaigns. And similarly, you have major pension funds such as PGGM and the United Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church, and even Norway's largest private pension fund, have all divested from companies profiting from Israel's occupation. And in the UK, you've got the co-op as well. Good on the co-op. So the answer is BDS is having a significant impact, exactly where it is supposed to, casting Israel as the pariah state in the international community that it is, along with North Korea and others of that ilk. But let's also be strategic for a second. Let's isolate and analyze just purely the economic situation. We want to stop the Israeli government's illegal actions in Gaza and the West Bank. And for that, we want to reduce their tax receipts every year, as that is what pays for the military and for the soldiers. That means we boycott companies who contribute to Israel's economy and tax receipts. Okay, so what are the big chunks of the Israel economy? I have to tell you that the data on this is very sparse, and I have a suspicion it is sparse because the Israelis are scared of the BDS movement, and for people like me who are going to do the research and tell you guys where to go after them. But regardless of that, this is what the data we found. We've got the diamond trade, which amounts to 23.2% of all exports out of Israel. Then we've got the tech sector, which Israel has the second largest number of startups after the USA globally. And we've got the financial and investment sector, which manages over $10 billion today in just the VC category. And then we've got the massive US aid given over a period of many years, amounting to over 124 billion. And then we've got the defense industry that accounts for 10% of all global defense exports. And the reality is that most of this we can't touch, because you see, most of the foreign direct investment coming into Israel and the bulk of the trade relations that Israel has are not with Muslim countries. And the primary economic partners to Israel are the USA, the UK, and Europe, with the US being by far the biggest of those partners. These are not obviously Muslims or necessarily pro-Palestinians who are on the other side of these transactions. So boycotting alone with us on this side and not actually transacting with Israel is not going to work. Side point, this actually might be a weird benefit of the Saudi-Israel normalization, because once that trade line is set up, both countries have something to lose. In which case, if Saudi was to boycott or even put pressure on Israel at that point, then that would have a very material impact, which it wouldn't do right now. But that is not a comment on Saudi normalization as a whole. It's just to point out that it has a material impact on the success of BDS if it does go ahead. Ultimately, sanctions are the holy grail, because that will affect Israel the most, just like it did with apartheid South Africa. Because when America divorces from Israel, that is a country that it relies on so heavily for economic, military, political, and moral backup. That's basically when Israel will fall in line with international law. So the goal goal must be to take steps to get us to that point. Stage 1 is boycotting, as we've discussed, as that is in our control. Stage 2 is campaigning for endowments, pension funds, local governments, and others to divest from the same companies that we've been boycotting. These funds will only do this once they've seen a bit of a groundswell behind this. Stage 3 is the hardest, and that's getting these governments, particularly the UK, the USA, to change its foreign policy and its approach with respect to Israel. And this will only happen after stage 1 and stage 2 have really increased the groundswell. This means, folks, that if we are embarking on boycotting, we must realize that it is not the end goal. It is a means to the end. And if we don't do two very important things, it will only have 10% of the effect that we actually wanted to do. And these two important things are, first, we must actually tell the company we are boycotting why we are boycotting them. Otherwise, they won't have the public pressure on them to change what they're doing. They'll just be looking at their numbers and thinking, hang on, well, it seems to be going down in value, but we don't really understand why. Tell them. Second, we must not stop at just boycotting. We must then start putting pressure on all of the funds who manage our money to divest from companies we find repugnant. We need to go from boycott to divestment. We need to start that motion off. Look, BDS is not illegal. No one stops you and me from deciding who we spend our money on or what goods we buy. There are certain countries that the Israel lobby has influenced, such as the USA, where they will only give government contracts out to companies who agree that they are not engaging in BDS. But frankly, even that is more symbolic than easily enforceable law. BDS is not immoral or racist when it is done to put pressure on a country that is committing war crimes and breaches of international law. We are not taking these actions because the state happens to be a Jewish majority country. We are doing it because of the actions alone. What would be immoral and racist is if we decide that any Jewish shop in the UK or globally, we will not frequent it because we figure that they must be supporting Israel. That would be racist, and we mustn't do that. There needs to be very clear evidence for support of illegality by any company that we actually boycott. This is really important. And this is vital for the reason I mentioned previously, which is that because Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer and people of that ilk, ultimately the people that we're going to have to convince to get the sanctions, whether we like it or not. Interestingly, boycotting is an activity of political pressure that the pro-Israeli communities have been very used to over many years. In a BDS article in The Guardian, Sharon Bruce, who's a leading progressive rabbi, says that she's not supportive of the BDS movement, but she does say that boycott is a tool that we in the Jewish community often use, and it is non-violent as well. And someone else says later on, Moin Rabbani, who's from the Institute of Palestinian Studies, says that, look, all these years we've heard from Israel and its supporters, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Where is the non-violent protester? And then when they're facing a completely non-violent BDS movement, they say, oh, we can't support that. And we only have to look at the pressure that has been put on Elon Musk. I understand, because the Israel lobby is very upset about pro-Palestinian content on its platform. It is very happy to boycott X and get companies such as Disney and IBM and Apple to get behind it and also boycott the X platform. So interestingly, this is a tool used by the Israel lobby when it suits its purposes. Right, folks, I know some of this video has been pretty heavy. Thank you for bearing with me. I promise you this section is going to be much more straightforward. The very first thing you need to do is a personal assessment of your own expenditure. What are the big companies you can and should leave? I would use two sources for this. One is boycott.thewitness.news, and the second is bdsmovement.net. Both of these websites are linked in the description below. I like these sources because they give their reasoning. They also pull from authentic sources such as the UN report that named and shamed the companies that operate in occupied territories, and they are part of a wider accepted and authentic collective group of many Palestinian organizations. This will likely give you a shortlist of around 10 companies that you regularly use and you now know that you need to transition away from. So for example, when I looked down the list, I cancelled my Disney subscription and I went with Netflix instead. Second, particularly focus your efforts on banks and funds and investment companies on this list, because these organizations are the conduits of money and therefore their impact magnifies the harm that is possible. And we know the South African story that I mentioned previously. So boycotting them is particularly important. I am also in the process of leaving my HSBC account right now, and I have marked that RBS and NatWest and Barclays are also also all on the naughty list, as they would have been alternatives if I had decided to move to them. I am now planning to move to Starling for now, and I know that a number of the digital banks who I have beef with for other reasons are actually fine, so you may want to consider them to move to. Third, if you're a business owner, do a full assessment of all the tools that you use. There's a website that is designed to help people buy Israeli tech products, and it was brought out in just shortly after October the 7th as a way to show support for Israel. But it is also a rather helpful screen for all the products that you should consider extremely carefully if you want to buy them. I'm not actually saying don't buy them. I'm saying consider them extremely carefully, because for Israeli companies, the propensity of Israeli companies to be supportive of the illegal actions that Israel is taking is just a little bit higher because of the fact that they are in Israel. So consider them carefully. So for example, Fiverr was on this list and it was donating to occupation forces early on in the conflict. And while Wix appeared to sack an employee for pro-Palestinian views in their Irish office. But not all of the companies on here will be directly contributing to illegality, so you will have to do your homework and use your judgment. Finally, folks, really important, as I've already mentioned, you should make people aware that you are boycotting. You should write or tweet to each of the companies that you are boycotting and let them know. You should also write to your local MP once you've done your exercise and let them know the companies that you are boycotting and why, and encourage them to speak out against those companies as well. And I know writing to your MP is a bit of a chore, but what makes it easy if you go right to them and just use their online platform, and they will literally make it easy for you to write a letter to your MP and get it sorted and sent within minutes. That's it for today, folks. Let me know in the comments below, what was the hardest thing you found boycotting? For our videographer Kabzi here, it was apparently Evian. For me, I think it was probably the HSBC bank account, because I've been with it since I was a youngster. Let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more about the economics behind this entire conflict, check out our recent interview with Sami Hamdi here. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.